thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for the invitation. I'm with EURDAT. EURDAT is a European network on debt and development. So we are a network of about 50 European NGOs that campaign for the fair and sustainable solutions to debt crises and also to related issues such as tax justice, effective development cooperation. We are also part of the Change Finance Coalition. The Change Finance Coalition has been founded at the beginning of the year to use the opportunity that we celebrate an interesting anniversary this year, the 10th anniversary of the financial crisis, to campaign for change of the financial system, to basically campaign for change towards a financial system that serves the people, is sustainable, is stable. And we had all months long, we had public street actions, especially around the 15th of September. The 15th of September was the 10th anniversary of the Lehman collapse, and also, discussions, expert discussions, political discussions like these, where we basically, want to develop our ideas further, what type of financial system we need to promote sustainable development and a fair society. Now that I have the privilege to speak after the bishop, let me also say that our network includes religious and secular organizations, but religious organizations always played a strong role when it came to debt relief or debt justice, because the Bible describes an ancient practice, which is the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee, it was an ancient practice of people in the Middle East that every 7 years all debts are relieved and all slaves will be freed. So where does this come from? This comes from the idea that while lending and borrowing are useful things in a society, and debt is a useful thing to keep societies together. I do something for you, you do something for me. It's something like a debt mechanism. Too much debt can cause a lot of problems, and you need to have a mechanism to get rid of those debt. And this was the idea behind the Jubilee debt relief. And for many decades already, there are Jubilee debt relief campaigns in Europe that campaign for fair solutions to debt crisis, and we are also the umbrella organization of these campaigns. So this is a little introduction. You heard a lot about the Hungarian situation today, so there are definitely better experts than me in the room for the country case. I'm going to focus on the global level, and I'm going to look back a little bit, and I'm also going to look into the future, what the risks of a future debt crisis are. Having talked about debt, as you can see, we have a lot of debt at the moment. This graph shows the situation from 2003 to 2018. When you look at the first two pillars, 2003 to 2008, that was the situation before the last financial crisis started. So you see a very steep increase in debt, especially this is the light gray in financial sector debt, and also the green, the household debt. So this was the situation in 2008. So now, and this basically caused the financial crisis. These were the bubbles that then burst in around 2008 globally. So go quickly back. How could this happen? What has caused the last financial crisis? It was obviously a quite complex phenomena, but three things are worth mentioning. The first thing is these three things are also interrelated. The first thing is we had a rising inequality. Or perhaps let me start by saying, of course, the crisis affected different regions of the world differently. It started in the United States of America and the USA, and it spread from there to Europe, and from Europe then also to the rest of the world. So it started as a US crisis, it turned into a North Atlantic financial crisis, and it then became a global financial crisis. And a situation we had all over the 90s and the early 2000s, especially in the USA, was in a situation of extremely fast rising inequality. So you had stagnating or decreasing real wages of the one side. On the other hand, you had wealth concentration on the other side. So the way how the US government reacted to the situation is, rather than making sure that the poor have higher incomes, they made it easier for them to access credit, to access loans. This was also in the interest of the rich, because the rich had to find ways to invest their money, and it was interested of the banks, because the banks got high commissions when they facilitated this lending from richer to poorer people. So this was the so-called situation of subprime lending. The financial crisis, when it started, was initially a subprime lending crisis. So related to this was also financialization. All over the 90s and 2000s, we had a situation in Europe, in North America, where more and more sectors of society, which once used to be under public control, sectors like housing, education, health, had been privatized. And rather than providing health service, education service, or housing as a public good, people had to pay for them, basically. And this was facilitated by the situation that access to credit was made much easier. So we had a whole set of new asset classes, like for instance, mortgages played a big role in the financial crisis, but also student loans. Student loans are now in the USA the second largest category of private debt after mortgages. So American students often graduate from university with a debt of more than $100,000. So this is another issue which basically boosted debt levels ahead of the last crisis. And the third factor was deregulation. Deregulation meant that less and less restrictions on the financial sector were lifted. The financial sector innovated. There was financial engineering. They created a lot of new products with all these kind of technical names, asset-backed securities, all kinds of derivatives, credit default swaps, which actually, in fact, when the crisis started, it turned out that most of these products only contained hot air. So they were very badly regulated. There were hardly any, there was no underlying value. It was basically an artificial house of cards that collapsed when the financial crisis started. So that was the situation that led to the collapse 10 years ago. So, but when we look back at this graph, you see when you look from the second to the third and the fourth column, rather than having a reduction of debt, we have now more debt than we used to have 10 years ago. So in fact, we have Greece slowed down a little bit, but we still have much higher debt levels, which means we have actually much higher risks today than we used to have 10 years ago. Let me give you a few details of this. These are now this data from the International Monetary Fund. So worldwide debt has reached 164 trillion US dollars. That's equal to 225% of GDP. So it's not just in absolute terms. The previous graph was in absolute terms, even as share of in relation to the world economy, which was of course a little bit growing over the past 10 years. We have now higher debt, a more leveraged economy than we used to have in 2009. Especially, we had a steep increase in public debt. In advanced economies, public debt has risen to 106.9% of GDP. That's the highest level ever we had in advanced economies in peace times. Only during the Second World War it was higher. Greece is of course a famous case. Greece is expected to reach 190% of GDP this year. It's 3 times the debt level which is considered sustainable under the EU's Maastricht criteria. In other countries, the situation is not much different. Italy has reached 130%. The USA, you might have heard that Donald Trump in Greece does very generous tax reform, lowering taxes on corporations and the rich. The way how they fund the budget is basically by borrowing more. So in the USA, that is increasing quickly now, which is a big problem. It is a big problem because to finance this, the USA has to attract money from all over the world and does so by raising interest rates. And these increasing US interest rates brings all other countries that have borrowed in US dollars in trouble. And this is why we have this emerging economy crisis, which also featured a lot in the news in recent weeks, especially, I guess, Turkey here. Turkey is in trouble. Argentina is in trouble. Argentina had to ask for money from the IMF already, and some other countries. And when we look at the world's poorest countries, even there, the situation has deteriorated quickly in recent years, which is especially, these countries are the ones who are most vulnerable to crisis and to the impact of the crisis. So when these countries are hit by crisis, they have very low buffers, so people quickly suffer and actually die when the economic situation gets worse. And also our organizations campaigned a lot for debt relief for the poorest countries in the 1990s. So the debt levels, they actually received debt relief, but the debt levels are basically back to where they used to be in the 1990s. So that's the situation with public debt. But we also have debt problems in the private sector. corporate debt, so that's debt by private corporations, has surged massively. It's also the highest level ever with 66 trillion US dollar. Corporations all over the world have used the availability of cheap money in recent years due to low interest rates in the USA and Europe, due to this quantitative easing, as it's called, to borrow massively, and especially to issue bonds. Not just in Europe, it was in Asia. Bond issuance tripled from 2017. The annual bond issuance within 1 year from 62 billion to 190 billion. Even low-income countries, the poorest countries, which couldn't even access financial markets. I mean, 10, 20 years ago, very poor countries such as Ghana or Zambia, they could borrow only from the World Bank or from official banks. Even those have started to access financial markets now, and they borrow at very high cost, 10% interest rates or so. So this is problematic, and this whole process has been, as I said, facilitated by the fact that the European Central Bank, also the Fed in the USA, the American Central Bank, the Japanese central banks, simply have you could say, printed trillions and trillions of money due to this quantitative easing policies. So this money was supposed to boost investment in these regions, in Europe and the USA, but because we have, of course, open financial markets mostly, the money flew to where the yields are higher, and this was in other countries than outside the EU or outside the Eurozone and the USA. And I mean, the system is probably not very sustainable, but the banks didn't care. And also in this case, the banks didn't care about this a lot, because you can make a lot of commissions by selling these financial products. So just last year, banks made $23 billion in commission on bond issuances. So having painted this a bit gloomy picture, so the little bit of the summary of this part is that the whole world economy is over-leveraged, and we have financial bubbles that are likely to burst in a new crisis. So that's my little, my small summary. So how could we come to this situation? When we look at the policy response of the EU and also the USA to the last crisis, you could say theoretically there are 5 things you can do when you are in a crisis. You could implement policies that promote growth, so you can try to grow out of a crisis. You can, when you have too much debt, so because debt is always seen as relation to GDP, so if you manage to boost your GDP, your debt problem is less severe. You can also implement austerity policies, so you can cut spending. So you can try to boost inflation. That's actually what they tried to do with this quantitative easing policies. They tried to inflate that away, but it didn't work so well. You can bail out institutions that got bankrupt, such as the banks, basically. And you could actually try to relieve restructured debts, so really to get rid of them. These are the 5 fundamental policy options you can choose. And when we look at which ones have been chosen, then you find, at least this is true for the Eurozone, or for many other countries, including Central and Eastern Europe as well, the policy mix that has been chosen was a mix of austerity on one side and bank bailouts on the other side. So the impact, of course, is that austerity decreases GDP, while the bank bailouts do not do away with debt, but they simply transfer debts from one balance sheet to the other, so from the bank's balance sheets to the public sector's balance sheets. And this is where we have this, where we got to the situation that we now have these extreme high public debt levels, basically all over the world, but especially in Europe. The same comment on quantitative easing. It was supposed to boost inflation and growth, but this in fact failed. I mean, the money flew to where the yields were highest, and I think this is a quote of the former Brazilian president Dilma Rousseff, who once said that Brazil has been basically hit by a tsunami of capital flows because speculators put their money in. And now that, I mean, yields in the USA are rising again, interest are rising, they're taking their money out, and this is causing this emerging markets crisis that we have now. The option that has not been chosen, unfortunately, are growth and debt restructuring. So this is the reason why we don't have the leveraging of the economy and no reduction of overall debt to GDP ratios. This is a little graph that I took from the Financial Times. So this shows you how different categories developed since the mid-1990s until now. And when you see the blue line, this is the financial corporates' debts. So they increased steeply between 1995 and 2008 when the crisis started. And then they stagnated or fell slightly. And then at about the same time when the financial crisis started, you have the increase, that's the light blue line in government debt. And this is basically the impact of the bank bailouts, which are estimated to have cost more than up to $4 trillion worldwide. So it was basically the financial sector reduced their debts on cost of the public sector. And of course, the public sector debt is paid, well, in fact, it's paid by citizens and taxpayers. So it's paid by you through higher taxes or through less public services because someone has to foot the bill. So this was the impact of the bank bailouts. Such cycles are not really new. We always have these a bit cyclical debt crisis cycles. So the situation that we used to have often, especially in a multi-country context, is that you have excessive savings and sluggish in some countries and sluggish growth in other countries. When you look at the EU, for instance, you have these so-called surplus countries, called Germany or Netherlands or so on. You had deficit countries ahead of the crisis. These were the so-called peripheral countries. And what happens is that savings from these countries, from the surplus countries, go to the deficit countries, which leads to rising debt levels in this deficit countries until it becomes unsustainable. Essentially, this is a typical mechanism. But before really a debt crisis starts, the first thing that happens is that the debt service costs are rising. Debt service costs as a share of public revenue. And we see steep increases at the moment, especially in developing countries. Not so much in the Eurozone at the moment because interest rates are still so low, but this will also change when the interest rates are going up. So that's, the implication of this is, of course, because debt service as one item in the public budget competes with all other types of spending. So the more a government spends on a debt service, the less it spends on public services or on investment that transform from the society, the economy. And when there was an evaluation earlier this year by the United Nations on what are the most important risks for the Sustainable Development Goals these days, the risk of a new debt crisis was cited as one of the most important reasons why the SDG implementation could fail by 2030. And the competition that increasing debt service has for financing sustainable development was cited as another reason. So this is the link between this crisis and the Sustainable Development Agenda. So another gloomy conclusion. So it could be possible that we have another lost decade at the doorstep, and this is of course not good prospects for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I hope I have a little bit of time left. Oops. So, where will the next crisis start? Obviously, no one can predict. This is there are risky zones, sectors, countries all over the world. A few examples to be mentioned, or a few extremely risky cases are already flagged. This corporate debt is a debt by private corporations and firms is a share or a category of debt that is often overlooked by regulators and is extremely high. If we have an increasing number of insolvencies by private firms, this will lead to non-performing loans in the financial sector, the collapse of the financial sector again. So this might be one area where the crisis starts. Financial sector debt continues to be a problem, especially we have these so-called too big to fail banks that are so big that they are systemically important and it's difficult to let them go bankrupt. So this might lead to new bailouts. Interestingly, China, while doing economically quite well, is an extremely heavily indebted country now. It's actually the country with the highest debt increase since the financial crisis started 10 years ago. Italy has also featured in the news recently. Italy is still a very vulnerable country in Europe when it comes to debt levels. It's probably the main reason why the European Central Bank continues to keep interest rates low, because they wouldn't know what to do when Italy can no longer refinance their debts. So this could lead to the return of the euro crisis. The USA is problematic because, as I said before, Mr. Trump doesn't want to raise taxes on rich people, so he decided to rather borrow. So debt is increasing quickly. Yeah, emerging economies are already in crisis, countries like Argentina and Turkey, and the more of them, European banks, for instance, are very exposed to Turkey. They have lent a lot of money to Turkey, so this can also have contagion effects towards Europe. And last but not least, we have also already crisis cases in the world's poorest countries, countries like Chad or Mozambique, who are already defaulted. So this is the situation. And then, yeah, here just quickly a graph. So these are the countries whose debt in percentage points increased most in the past 10 years. It's in Spanish, but anyway, you see the countries. So Turkey and China and Mexico actually topped the list, and Luxembourg due to the strong presence of the financial sector in this country. So Luxembourg as such is not vulnerable, but the financial sector is. Yeah, last but not least, what are we going to do about this? I mean, what we are advocating for is on the prevention side of crisis, that you actually, I said in the beginning, I mean, the crisis started due to too much leveraging in the economy, and leveraging started because there were no other sources of income except loans and debts, basically. So individuals as well as states need other sources of income, and this is why we campaign for higher wages, for decent wages for people, for more equity in loan financing for corporations, and also for tax justice, for fighting tax evasions. When you look, for instance, on graphs that show public finance, you see that corporate tax rates around over the past 10, 20 years always went down, while debt levels went up. So basically, if you could curb corporate tax evasion, basically it would already be very helpful to reduce borrowing needs. When it comes to lending as such, we advocate for responsible lending and borrowing practices. There are, for instance, a number of financing instruments that reduce risks, where the creditor takes a certain co-responsibility, very technical terms, GDP-linked bonds, for instance. But then, of course, very important is that we have better institutions for the resolution of debt crisis. I mentioned before that debt restructuring, debt relief has been policy option that has been only very few cases chosen. In Europe, there was only one debt restructuring that was in Greece in 2010, and it came too late. Basically when most of the creditors had already left the country, and the Eurozone, the Troika, had already started to bail out the private creditors. So we need to have actually more ways to actually restructure and relieve debts. And one reason why this policy option is not chosen that often is actually that we don't have institutions to get this done. A big problem we have in the international financial architecture is that there's no insolvency law, and there's also no insolvency court for sovereign debtors. It's a very, very big difference to, like, say, corporate insolvencies or so, where you have a legal framework that decides exactly what to do, and you have an insolvency court. So there's an institutional gap, and this is also one reason why governments have the incentive to say, okay, we rather bail out creditors than having an orderly insolvency procedure, because it's so difficult to do one. So these are just a few options, the need for reforms that we identified. There's certainly more, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.